She had built a $1 billion empire from a single idea, survived boardroom wars that broke men twice her size, and never once asked anyone to carry something she couldn't carry herself. Then one night, a helicopter fell out of a clear sky, and Serena Whitmore, 30 years old, unstoppable, terrifying in the best possible way, woke up in a hospital bed, unable to feel her legs. 6 months later, the world's finest specialists had given up. The machine designed to save her was killing her hope instead. And then a man walked through her door carrying a dented metal toolbox and smelling faintly of motor oil. And everything changed. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a single story. Because we release new ones every week. And trust me, you don't want to be the one who finds out too late. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it is absolutely worth every minute. The helicopter went down on a Tuesday. That detail always struck people as strange afterward, the specific, ordinary weekday of it. Not a Friday when you might expect recklessness. Not a Monday weighted with the start of something. Just a Tuesday in early October, the sky above western Pennsylvania clear enough that the pilot had made a point of commenting on it. Good flying weather, he'd said, and Serena had barely looked up from the contract spread across her lap. She didn't remember the impact. The neurologist told her that was normal, that the brain protected itself from the worst moments by simply not recording them. What she remembered was the contracts, the pilot's comment about the sky, and then waking up 3 days later in a room that smelled like antiseptic and artificial flowers, her mother's hand wrapped around hers so tightly it hurt. "Hey," her mother had said. Just that. "Hey." Like Serena had walked in late to dinner. "My legs," Serena said. Her mother didn't answer right away. That was the answer. Serena Whitmore had started Whitmore Biotech at 23 with $40,000 she'd borrowed from her uncle and a patent application she'd filed herself after teaching herself patent law over one sleepless summer. The company made rehabilitation technology, exoskeletons, nerve stimulation rigs, custom mobility systems for people who'd been told their bodies were finished. She'd built it not because she understood what those patients felt, but because she understood engineering, and she could see with clean engineering clarity that the existing products were designed by people who cared more about manufacturing cost than about the actual human beings strapped inside them. 7 years later, Whitmore Biotech was worth $4.3 billion. Serena sat on the board of 2 hospitals, had been on the cover of 3 magazines she'd never actually read, and had a standing 7 a.m. spin class reservation she kept canceling because she was always already at the office. She didn't have time to be paralyzed. She genuinely, practically, with full logistical seriousness, did not have the schedule for it. That thought, absurd, almost funny, was the thing that kept cycling through her mind in those first raw weeks in the rehabilitation ward. Not grief, not fear, not even the specific terror of what her body had become. Just this low, persistent irritation, like she double-booked herself for something she couldn't get out of. The official diagnosis was incomplete spinal cord injury at the T6 vertebral level. Incomplete meant there was still signal getting through, still some theoretical communication between her brain and her lower body. It also meant the doctors couldn't tell her exactly what was possible and what wasn't, which Serena found more maddening than a clean prognosis would have been. She could tolerate a hard no. What she couldn't tolerate was, "We'll see." The company's board moved quickly, which she would have appreciated under any other circumstance. Within the first month, they had contracted with 3 separate rehabilitation engineering firms and arranged for Serena to receive what her director of operations, a careful man named Douglas Hale, called the best available care in the country. Douglas was 58, wore the same cut of charcoal suit every day, and had a gift for delivering bad news with his face set in an expression of such practiced neutrality that you often weren't sure the news was bad until you were alone in your car. "We've brought in Kessler's team from Newark," he told her during one of his weekly updates. "They're adapting our own resync platform specifically for your case." "Our platform," Serena said. "The Generation 4 resync, yes." She looked at him. "Douglas, I built that system. I know every limitation in it. The engineers believe they can work around the existing constraints. They believe that because they've never been in the chair. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Would you like me to arrange a call with Dr. Kessler directly? No, she said. I'd like you to get me results. The results did not come. 6 months of them not coming produced a particular kind of exhaustion that Serena had never encountered before. She'd been tired before. The startup years, the first big product recall, the 18 months of litigation after a competitor tried to steal 3 of her core patents. But that had been the exhaustion of fighting. This was different. This was the exhaustion of waiting for a fight that never quite started, of systems and specialists and recalibration sessions and progress notes that never seemed to accumulate into anything you could hold in your hand. The resync rig had been adjusted 17 times. She'd worked with 2 physiotherapists, a neurological specialist flown in from Zurich, and a software engineer from their own R&D department who spent 4 days staring at her spinal scans like they contained a code he was this close to cracking. She could feel pressure in her right thigh on certain days. Her left foot occasionally registered sensation when the physiotherapist applied targeted stimulation at a very specific point just below her ankle. That was it. That was 6 months of the best available care in the country. She was in her penthouse apartment now, the rehabilitation ward officially discharged. The company's money having transformed the top floor of her building into something between a medical facility and a life she almost recognized. The penthouse had always been clean and sharp-edged. She'd hired a designer who understood that she didn't want a home that felt cozy. She wanted one that felt efficient. Now there were ramps where there had been a step down to the kitchen, a hospital-grade adjustable bed in the master bedroom, and a corner of the main room given over to the resync platform and its tangle of equipment. She'd asked them to at least put a curtain around it. Douglas had sent someone to install one. She never closed it. The board meeting happened on a Thursday morning, conducted over video because 3 of the 7 members were in different cities, and because, Serena suspected, at least 2 of them preferred not to be in the same room as her right now. She could see them on the screen arrayed in their home offices and conference rooms, and she could read the specific quality of their collective discomfort the way you read weather. They were not cruel people. They simply had a company to protect, and she had become, in a clinical and impersonal sense, a variable they didn't know how to calculate. "We've received a recommendation," said Marcus Elroy, who was chair of the technology subcommittee and the most direct of them when it came to unpleasant conversations. "An unconventional one." "How unconventional?" Serena asked. The referral came through Dr. Nakamura's office. She apparently encountered this individual's work through a colleague in the Veteran Rehabilitation Network. Marcus paused. "He's not a physician. He's not a certified rehabilitation engineer. He has no advanced degree." "Marcus, what is he?" "He repairs mobility equipment, wheelchairs, prosthetic rigs, older exoskeleton models. He works out of a garage in Millbrook, I know where Millbrook is, which is not an impressive facility. He has no staff. His business is essentially himself and whatever tools he owns personally." Marcus cleared his throat. "He also has an 8-year-old daughter he's raising alone, which I mention only to provide context for his financial situation, which is he good at what he does?" A small pause. "Dr. Nakamura seems to think so. Unusually so, from the way she described it." Serena looked at the screen, at 7 faces trying to arrange themselves into neutral territory. She thought about 17 adjustments to the resync rig. She thought about the engineer from Zurich and his 4 days of staring at scans. "Bring him in," she said. His name was Ethan Brooks, and he did not look like someone who had come to change anything. He was a 32, medium height, lean in the way that comes from not eating enough rather than from discipline. He had dark circles under his eyes that suggested a child who didn't sleep well, or a man who lay awake too long thinking about money, or both. He wore a clean button-down shirt that had clearly been ironed by someone who hadn't done much ironing, the collar slightly crooked, a faint crease running at the wrong angle across one sleeve. He carried a toolbox that was old enough to have belonged to someone else first, its surface dented and scratched to the point where the original color was a matter of guesswork. Douglas met him in the lobby. Serena watched the security footage afterward. She made a habit of watching her own lobby footage when she was deciding about people, and what she noticed was that Douglas did not shake Ethan's hand. He nodded, gestured toward the elevator, and walked 2 steps ahead the entire way. When they came through the apartment door, 2 of the company's engineers were already in the room, standing near the resync equipment with their arms folded. One of them, a man named Patterson who had been with the R&D department for 6 years, looked at Ethan's toolbox the way you might look at someone who'd shown up to a formal dinner in work boots. "Mr. Brooks," Douglas said, "this is our CEO, Serena Whitmore." Ethan looked at her, not at the chair first, the way most people did, at her face. "Thanks for having me," he said. His voice was quieter than she'd expected. Not timid, just measured, like someone who had learned to be careful with words because he didn't have the energy to waste them. "I'm told you repair equipment," Serena said. "Mostly, yeah. And what is it you think you can do here that 6 months of specialists haven't managed?" He didn't answer immediately. He set his toolbox down on the floor beside him, carefully, and looked at the resync platform in the corner. Then he looked back at her. "I don't know yet," he said. "I haven't looked at you yet." Patterson made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Douglas kept his face carefully neutral. Serena said, "All right." The first thing Ethan asked for was an hour alone with her. No engineers, no Douglas, no physiotherapist standing by to explain things. Douglas objected immediately, citing liability, protocol, the fact that Ethan was not a certified medical professional and therefore could not. "Douglas," Serena said. "Yes." "Leave the room." He left. Patterson and the other engineer went with him, Patterson's expression carrying the particular combination of contempt and wounded professionalism that Serena had seen before in people who confused credentials with competence. When the door closed, Ethan sat down in the chair across from her, not pulling it to face her directly, but slightly angled, like he was sitting beside her rather than opposite. He didn't open the toolbox. He didn't look at the equipment. He looked at her. "Can you walk me through a typical session?" he asked. "Not the technical specs, just what it feels like. What they do first, what happens to your body." So she did. She'd described it dozens of times to doctors, to Douglas, to her mother on the phone, and each time it had come out flatter than the actual experience, the words failing to carry the specific texture of what it felt like to be strapped into a rig that cost more than most people's houses and feel it do absolutely nothing. But Ethan listened in a way that was different from how specialists listened. He didn't nod at the technical details. He nodded at the other parts. The part where she said the left shoulder strap always pressed slightly forward. The part where she described the faint burning sensation in her upper back during the stimulation sequence. The part where she mentioned almost as an aside that the hip alignment always felt slightly off to her right. "Slightly off," he said. "Like a symmetric or like I'm being held at an angle I didn't choose." He was quiet for a moment. "Which direction does it pull?" "Forward and right." He wrote something in a small notebook, actual handwriting, in a notebook with a cardboard cover. She found that oddly interesting. "Nobody's asked me that before," she said. "What? About the direction?" "About any of it, the way you're asking." He looked up from the notebook. "They're trying to fix the machine," he said. "Which makes sense. It's an expensive machine." A pause. "But you're not a spec sheet." He came back the next day and the day after, and he still hadn't touched the resync equipment. The engineers who'd been assigned to supervise his access filed 2 separate internal complaints in those first 48 hours, both of which landed on Douglas's desk with the specific heat of people who felt professionally insulted. Douglas brought them to Serena, who read them and set them aside. "He's not doing anything," Douglas said. "He's been here 2 days and he hasn't touched the system." "He's doing plenty," Serena said. "He's just not doing it to the machine." What Ethan was doing was watching. He watched how she transferred from the chair to the examination surface. He watched where her weight went when she reached for something. He asked her physiotherapist to demonstrate the standard stimulation protocol while he stood 2 feet away and watched from an angle the therapist apparently found uncomfortable, because she later told Douglas it felt like being graded. He took photographs. He asked permission first, and he was specific about what he was photographing, always a particular point of posture or position, never anything that felt invasive. He measured things with an old set of calipers and a cloth measuring tape, and a small digital level that he'd pull out and hold against various surfaces with a focus that was almost excessive. On the evening of the second day, sitting in the main room while the light outside went orange through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Serena watched him making notes and said, "You're not what I expected." He didn't look up. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd come in with a plan already made, a pitch, something to sell." "I don't have anything to sell." That's what I mean. He set the notebook down on his knee and looked at her. He had an honest face. Not kind exactly, just honest, like it didn't have the muscle memory for performing emotions. It wasn't feeling. My daughter asked me last night what I was doing, he said. She's 8, so I tried to explain it in a way that made sense to her. I told her someone's body was sending messages that weren't getting received the right way, and I was trying to figure out why. Serena waited. She said, "Did I ask them what the messages were supposed to say?" He made a small, dry sound. Kids are occasionally smarter than everyone in the room. Did that answer make sense to her? She wanted to know if you had a cat. He picked up the notebook again. I told her I didn't know. I don't, Serena said. I travel too much. Traveled. A small silence. I'll figure this out, he said. Not loudly, not with the particular salesmanship of someone who needed her to believe him. Just a statement of intention, plain and a little tired, like a man reminding himself as much as telling her. She found to her own surprise that she believed him. The board called an emergency session on the 4th day. Marcus led it, which was expected. What was not expected, or perhaps was, depending on how carefully you'd been paying attention, was how quickly the conversation moved from concern to something harder. He has no certification in any relevant field, Marcus said. He has no malpractice coverage. He has no institutional affiliation. We are allowing an unqualified individual unsupervised access to our CEO, and if something goes wrong, nothing has gone wrong, Serena said. Not yet. He hasn't touched anything yet. Serena. Marcus leaned forward slightly in the way he did when he wanted to convey both seriousness and compassion, and mostly conveyed that he'd practiced the gesture. I understand that 6 months of setbacks are exhausting. I understand the impulse to try something different, but the reputational risk alone, to the company, to everyone involved. She looked at the screen. 7 faces. Good people, most of them. Careful people. People who had helped her build something real. And not a single one of them had sat in that chair for 6 months watching specialists nod thoughtfully at a machine that wasn't working. I want 3 days, she said. 3 days for what exactly? 3 days for Ethan Brooks to finish what he's doing. Then we reassess. The board deliberated. She watched them deliberate, the muted side conversations and the careful expressions, and she thought about what Ethan had said about the messages and about his daughter asking if she had a cat. 3 days, Marcus finally said, and we'll need daily reports from Patterson's team. Fine, Serena said. After the call ended, Douglas lingered. He stood near the window with his hands behind his back, looking out at the city below, and for a long moment he didn't say anything. You know the engineers think he's embarrassing, he finally said. I know. They're not wrong that he's unqualified. They're not wrong about the credential part. She turned the chair toward the window, toward the pale November sky. But I watched Patterson spend a week not asking me a single question about my own body. Ethan's been here 4 days, and I've talked more about what I actually experienced than I have in the entire 6 months before him. She paused. Qualifications tell you what someone was taught. They don't tell you whether they're paying attention. Douglas was quiet for a moment. What do you think he's going to find? I don't know, she said. But I think he's actually looking. Atan. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Ethan finally opened the toolbox. Patterson and his colleague were in the room, standing back near the far wall with the particular stillness of people who want to observe without appearing to observe. Douglas was in the kitchen, present but distant, the way he did everything. Ethan had printed out 3 pages of notes and laid them flat on the table beside the resync platform. He stood in front of the rig for a full 5 minutes, not moving, reading the notes, and then looking at the machine, and then looking at Serena. Can I show you something? He said. Go ahead. He pointed to the hip cradle, the padded assembly that positioned the pelvis during the stimulation sequence. What angle does this lock at? Patterson answered immediately. 7 degrees anterior tilt. It's calibrated to the standard rehabilitation position per the resync protocol. Standard for who? Patterson blinked. The standard rehabilitation patient profile. Ethan looked at Serena. Your pelvis naturally rests at closer to 4 degrees, maybe 3.5. The difference is small, but it shifts the entire load distribution. He turned back to the machine. Every time you're in this rig, the stimulation pathway is targeting a nerve cluster that's sitting a few millimeters from where the system thinks it is. So the signal's going out, it's just landing in the wrong place. The room was very quiet. Patterson said, That kind of variance is within the acceptable calibration range for the system. We account for individual variation in the software. You account for it with a software adjustment, Ethan said, but the physical position is still wrong. The software is trying to compensate for a mechanical misalignment. That's like, he paused, searching for words. It's like trying to fix a bad door hinge by adjusting the lock. The lock's not the problem. Serena was watching him. Can it be corrected? He turned back to her. I need to build a different cradle assembly, matched to your actual geometry, not the standard profile. He glanced down at his notes. I also think there's a secondary issue with the shoulder harness creating compensatory tension in your upper thoracic region, which is probably why you've had that burning sensation. But the hip position is the main thing. Douglas had come out of the kitchen. He was standing in the doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets, his face doing the thing it did when he was recalculating. How long? Serena asked. To build it? Ethan thought for a moment. 2 days, maybe a day and a half if I work tonight. Then you'd better get started, she said. He picked up the toolbox. And for the first time since he'd walked through her door, something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. A small, private expression of a man who had spent his whole life paying attention to things other people walked past, and who had just been told, for once, that it had counted for something. Ethan worked through the night. Not in the penthouse. He'd taken his measurements and his notes and driven the 40 minutes back to Millbrook in a truck that needed a new alternator and that he'd been nursing along for 7 months with a combination of mechanical intuition and deliberate ignorance of the check engine light. He got home at 9:15, found his neighbor Mrs. Calloway asleep in the armchair with the television on and his daughter Lily curled under a blanket on the couch, and stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her. Lily was 8 in the way that some 8-year-olds were 40, serious about certain things, silly about others, with an unnerving capacity for reading the room that she'd developed early and that Ethan suspected had something to do with growing up in a house where the room often needed reading. She had her mother's dark hair and Ethan's tendency to chew on the inside of her cheek when she was thinking hard about something. He woke Mrs. Calloway gently, thanked her, saw her out. He didn't wake Lily. He stood in the kitchen for a few minutes, eating cold pasta directly from the container in the refrigerator, looking at the pile of bills on the counter that he'd arranged in order of urgency sometime last week, and that had since drifted into a more honest pile of general anxiety. The electric bill was 3 weeks out. The truck payment was 2. He had a check coming from the VA referral network for a prosthetic repair job he'd finished last month. But the VA paid on its own schedule, and its own schedule bore no relationship to any calendar Ethan had ever encountered. He rinsed the container, set it in the drying rack, and went out to the garage. The garage was small and cold, and lit by 4 shop lights he'd strung himself from the ceiling joists. It contained more tools than furniture, which he'd decided long ago was the right set of priorities for the space available. One wall was pegboard hung with wrenches and socket sets, and a collection of specialized bits he'd accumulated over 8 years of working on equipment that nobody else in the county seemed to know how to fix. The opposite wall had a steel workbench he'd bought secondhand from a machine shop that was going out of business, its surface scarred from decades of work that had nothing to do with him, and he found that comforting in a way he'd never tried to articulate. He set his notes under the bench light and looked at them for a long time. The problem was straightforward. The solution was straightforward. What was not straightforward was fabricating a precision hip cradle assembly from the materials available to him in a garage in Millbrook without access to a CNC mill, a medical-grade fabrication shop, or anyone who'd done this kind of custom work before, because the reason custom rehabilitation hardware was so expensive was precisely that you needed all of those things. In theory, Ethan had been solving in-theory problems with what he actually had for most of his adult life. He found a piece of high-density polyethylene sheet in the back corner, salvaged from a job 2 years ago, a mobility scooter repair where the client had upgraded the seating platform and let him keep the old material. He found aircraft-grade aluminum bar stock he'd bought at an estate sale from a retired aerospace machinist's workshop, not knowing exactly what he'd use it for, just knowing it was too good to leave behind. He found the shoulder harness components in his head before he found them physically, working through the geometry of what he needed, and then looking for the pieces to match it. He worked until 2 in the morning. He slept 4 hours on the cot he kept in the corner for exactly this kind of night, woke before his alarm, made coffee in the small machine on the workbench shelf, and worked until 6:30 when he heard Lily's feet on the kitchen floor above him. He went inside. She was standing at the counter in her pajamas, her hair chaotic from sleep, staring into the open cereal cabinet with the expression of someone facing a genuinely difficult decision. "Morning," he said. "There's no more of the good cereal," she said. "There's oatmeal." "That's not cereal. That's punishment." "It's a grain. It qualifies." She turned around and looked at him the way she looked at him when she was assessing whether he'd slept. The assessment was apparently not favorable. "You worked all night again." "Most of it." "Is it for the lady with the chair?" "Yeah." Lily considered this. She had a particular way of processing information. She got quiet and her eyes went slightly unfocused, and then she came back. "Is she nice?" He thought about it. "She's honest," he said, "which is its own kind of nice." "Does she have a cat yet?" "Still no cat?" Lily shook her head in a way that conveyed both sympathy and mild judgment, then turned back to the cereal cabinet and made her peace with the oatmeal. He dropped her at school at 7:45, was back on the highway toward the city by 8, and walked into the penthouse at 9:30, carrying the partially assembled cradle and a list of additional measurements he needed before he could finish the fit. Douglas was already there. So was Patterson, and a man Ethan hadn't seen before, older, in a suit that fit too well to be off the rack, with the kind of controlled posture that came from decades of conference rooms. "This is Gerald Wynn," Douglas said. "He's a member of the board." Wynn looked at Ethan the way Marcus had described Ethan in the board meeting, with the specific patience of someone who had already reached a conclusion and was now simply waiting for events to catch up to it. "I wanted to see what we were working with," he said. "Morning," Ethan said. He set the equipment down and looked around the room. "Where's Serena?" "Miss Whitmore is getting ready," Douglas said. "She'll be out shortly." Wynn stepped forward and looked at the partially assembled cradle on the table. He picked up one of the aluminum components and turned it in his hand. "Is this from a hardware store?" "Estate sale," Ethan said. "Aerospace stock. It's the right alloy." "It doesn't look like medical equipment." "It'll work like medical equipment." Ethan took the component back carefully and set it back on the table. "Or better, actually." Wynn looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Brooks, I'm going to be direct with you. I'd appreciate that. The board has significant concerns about the liability exposure this arrangement creates. You are not a licensed rehabilitation engineer. You are not a medical professional of any kind. If something goes wrong with whatever you're building, the company's insurance position becomes extremely complicated." "I understand," Ethan said. "I'm not sure you do. If Ms. Whitmore is injured, then she's injured, and that's on me, not on the company." He said it without heat, without defensiveness, just stating a fact. "I've been clear about that. You don't have the assets to absorb that kind of liability." "No," Ethan agreed. "I don't." He looked at the man steadily. "But she's been sitting in that rig for 6 months going nowhere, and the people with all the right credentials and all the right liability coverage haven't done anything about it. So." He left the "so" there, complete without a period, and went back to his notes. Wynn was quiet. Patterson looked at the floor. Douglas did the thing with his face. Serena came out from the hallway. She'd been listening. He could tell by the slight delay in her expression catching up to the situation, the way you looked when you were transitioning from hearing something to reacting to it. She looked at Wynn first, then at Ethan, then at the equipment on the table. "Gerald," she said. "Good morning." "Serena, I was just explaining to Mr. Brooks." "I heard what you were explaining." Her voice was level. "And I appreciate the board's diligence. I genuinely do. But we've had this conversation, and we've reached a position, and that position is 3 days." She looked at the table. "Is that the cradle?" "Partially," Ethan said. "I need your measurements before I can finish the fit." "Then let's do that." Wynn stood very still for a moment. He was a man accustomed to rooms orienting around his presence, and this one had just reoriented around someone else, and he was deciding what to do about it. He decided to leave. He did it with dignity, said something about a 10 o'clock call, and walked out with Douglas trailing behind him like a satellite losing orbit. Patterson stayed. He stayed with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral, and Ethan noted it and set it aside. The measurement session took 2 hours. Ethan worked slowly and explained what he was doing as he went, which Serena had not asked him to do, but which she found herself grateful for. The neurological specialist from Zurich had spoken at her like she was a very intelligent audience member at a lecture, informed enough to follow along, not technical enough to engage directly. Ethan spoke to her like she was a collaborator who happened not to have his specific vocabulary yet. "The pelvis isn't fixed," he said, adjusting the measuring tape along her hip line. "It shifts depending on how you're positioned, what muscles are engaged, what surface you're on. The standard cradle assumes a static measurement and locks to it, which is fine for an average patient on an average day." He made a note. "You're not average, and the rig shouldn't be built like you are." "Nobody's ever said it quite like that." "The too nice version or the accurate version?" "Both." She watched him work. "You do this differently than the physical therapists do." "How so?" "They measure to confirm what they expect. You measure to find out what's there." He glanced up. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "I'm not sure yet." He finished the measurements and went back to the workbench he'd set up in the corner of the room. Douglas had arranged for a proper workbench to be brought in after day 2, a concession to the fact that Ethan was not, in fact, going away. Patterson watched from across the room with his arms still folded, and after about 20 minutes of this, Ethan looked up. "You want to ask me something," he said. Patterson blinked. "Excuse me?" "You've been standing there like you're waiting for me to make a mistake, which is fine, I get it. But if you actually have a question about the approach, I'll answer it." A pause. Patterson unfolded his arms. "The nerve pathway compression theory," he said. "We ran models. The variance in hip position falls within the system's adaptive compensation range. I know, I read your documentation. Then you understand why we didn't flag it." "I understand why the model didn't flag it," Ethan said. "Models don't have nerve endings. Serena does." He went back to the component in his hand. "Your model said the variance was within acceptable range. Her body said it wasn't. When those two things conflict, I think you check the body." Patterson was quiet for a moment. "How did you know to look at the hip position?" Ethan set the tool down. "She told me it felt like she was being held at an angle she didn't choose. On day 1. I wrote it down." Another silence. "We have session notes going back 6 months." "I know, I read those too." He picked the tool back up. "The notes recorded what the equipment was doing, not what she said it felt like." Patterson looked at the floor. He unfolded his arms completely, which was apparently as far as he was willing to go, and after a moment he pulled up a stool from the corner and sat down about 8 feet away from the workbench, watching Ethan work without speaking. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't agreement, but it was something, and Ethan recognized it as the variety of something that a person like Patterson, careful and credentialed and privately frightened of being wrong, was capable of offering. He finished the cradle assembly that evening. Serena had gone to do calls in the afternoon. The company didn't stop because she was in a chair, a fact she'd made very clear in the first month, and that had required some adjustment from a board accustomed to illness as an operational pause. Ethan worked while she worked, the sounds of her voice carrying occasionally from the study, sharp and specific, and completely unlike the way she spoke in the room with him. He found it interesting, the way people had different registers, different selves for different rooms. He'd watched enough of it over the years to stop being surprised by it. His ex-wife had been like that, warm in the kitchen, formal on the phone, distant in arguments, and he'd spent too many years trying to figure out which version was the real one before understanding that all of them were. He didn't let himself think about that for long. He was good at redirecting. Serena came back into the main room at 6, setting her phone on the table with the particular firmness of someone ending a disagreement. "Bored?" he asked, without looking up. "Marcus," she said. "He's decided the 3-day window was a courtesy, not a commitment." She looked at the assembled cradle on the table. "Is that finished?" "Just needs the final pad adjustment." He held it up. "Can I show you?" She wheeled over. He walked her through the geometry, the specific angle of the hip cradle, the way it would position her pelvis at her natural resting point rather than the standardized profile, the modified shoulder harness design that would reduce the compensatory tension in her upper back. I used his hands to illustrate the angles because he'd always been better at explaining physical things physically than verbally, and she followed without asking him to slow down. The theory is that once your pelvis is at the right angle, he said, the stimulation sequence should be hitting the nerve cluster where it actually is instead of where the standard model says it should be. And if it doesn't work, then I reassess. He set the cradle down. I want to be honest with you. I'm confident in the mechanical analysis. I'm not a neurologist. I can't promise you how your nervous system is going to respond to a corrected stimulus pathway. She looked at him steadily. No one's ever said that to me either. Which part? The part where they admitted the limit of what they know. He shrugged. Seems like the honest thing. It is. She looked at the equipment. When do we try it? Tomorrow morning. I want to come in fresh, and I want you to come in fresh. She nodded. Then she said, almost as an aside, the board is going to call for a vote if this doesn't show something in the next 24 hours. I know. And if they vote to terminate the arrangement, then they do. He started packing the tools back in order. He always packed them in order, because you needed to be able to find things fast when something wasn't working. I'll have given it what I had. That's the only thing I know how to do. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was going dark, the lights coming up across the skyline in the way that always made cities look more planned than they were. Can I ask you something personal? She said. Sure. Your daughter, what's her name? Lily. How old? 8. Serena nodded slowly. She knows you're here? She knows I'm trying to help someone. He closed the toolbox. I don't give her the whole picture on everything. She worries. About you? About everything, he said. She's 8 going on 50 sometimes. He picked up the toolbox. She wanted me to ask if you have a cat. I keep forgetting. You keep telling me I don't. I keep confirming what I already know, which is bad research practice. He almost smiled. Do you want one? Serena made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh he'd heard from her yet. Short and slightly surprised, like it had gotten out before she'd decided to let it. I wouldn't know what to do with one. They mostly take care of themselves, he said, which is either their best quality or their most frustrating one, depending on the day. He said goodnight and went home, and on the highway back to Millbrook he drove in silence because the radio had stopped working 3 weeks ago, and he hadn't fixed it yet, and in the silence he let himself think about tomorrow. Not with fear exactly, more with the particular quality of attention you brought to something you'd measured and calculated and still couldn't fully control, the honest acknowledgement that some part of what happened next was beyond him. He could design for the possible. He couldn't design for certainty. He'd learned that the hard way, in a different context, in a different life, and the lesson had cost him more than he was willing to count up tonight. He got home. Mrs. Calloway had Lily bathed and in bed, reading to herself by flashlight under the covers, which she thought she was hiding and which Ethan had been pretending not to know about for 2 years because it was the exact thing he would have done at her age. He knocked on the door. Lights out. Rustling. The flashlight clicked off with suspicious speed. I was already asleep, Lily said. You were talking. In my sleep. You're very literate for a sleepwalker. More rustling. Then, Dad, is tomorrow the day? He leaned against the door frame. Might be. Are you scared? He thought about saying no. He thought about what the useful answer was and whether they were the same, and decided for once they weren't far apart. A little, he said. The useful kind. What's the useful kind? The kind that makes you check your work one more time. A pause. Okay, she said. Good. Go to sleep. I am asleep. He went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with his notes spread in front of him and went through every measurement, every calculation, every assumption in the design. He found 2 things he wanted to verify in the morning before they ran the first session. He wrote them down, circled them, set his alarm for 5:30. The bills were still on the counter. He didn't look at them tonight. In the morning, the building's lobby had a different guard on the desk. Someone new who looked at Ethan's name on the visitor list with the particular skepticism of someone who thought the list might be wrong. Ethan waited while the guard called up, standing with the toolbox at his feet and his notes tucked under his arm, in the same ironed crooked shirt as 2 days ago, because he owned 4 shirts that were appropriate for this kind of situation, and this was the one that hadn't developed any new problems yet. Douglas met him at the elevator. "Gerald Wynn is coming back this afternoon," he said, by way of good morning. "I figured. And Marcus has requested a live update call during the session." Ethan looked at him. "No." Douglas blinked. "Excuse me?" "No live call during the session. If something's happening with Serena's body, I need to be paying attention to her, not to a conference line." He stepped into the elevator. "They can have a full report after." Douglas opened his mouth, closed it, stepped in beside him. "I'll relay that. I'd also need Patterson out of the room, him or anyone else who's going to be watching like they're waiting for a fire. Patterson is the lead engineer on the resync system. He can come back in after the first sequence. I want the first 20 minutes quiet." Douglas did the face. The elevator rose. "You're aware," Douglas said carefully, "that you're in a fairly tenuous position to be making demands." "I'm not making demands. I'm telling you what the session needs." Ethan watched the floor numbers go up. If Gerald Wynn wants to stand in that room and monitor the situation, Serena's going to be thinking about Gerald Wynn, and I need her thinking about her foot. A pause. "I'll see what I can do," Douglas said. What he could do, it turned out, was considerable. When the elevator opened, the main room was empty except for Serena and her physiotherapist, a quiet woman named Rosa, who had been with her since the rehabilitation ward and who had a gift for being professionally present without being intrusive. Patterson was somewhere else. Wynn was apparently held up in traffic. The board's live call had been moved to a post-session debrief. Serena looked at him when he came in. "Douglas said you threw your weight around." "I asked for what the session needed." "Same thing sometimes." She looked at the assembled cradle on the table. "Is that ready?" "Mostly." He set down the toolbox and pulled out the notes. "I want to verify 2 measurements before we start. It'll take 15 minutes. She held out her arms. "Do what you need to do." He worked through the verification carefully, Rosa holding position markers while he confirmed angles, nobody speaking much. The penthouse was quiet in the morning. The city noise came up through the windows as a kind of ambient texture rather than individual sounds, and the light was that flat gray-white of a November overcast that made everything look slightly more serious than it was. When he was satisfied, he and Rosa together transferred Serena into the modified cradle assembly, integrating it with the resync platform's existing framework. It took longer than it should have because 2 of the attachment points required adjustment, small things, fractions of an inch. But he didn't rush them. Rosa watched him work without comment, and after a few minutes he understood that she wasn't watching critically. She was learning the approach. He showed her the specific alignment points, explained what he was looking for, and she nodded without writing anything down, which was the sign of someone who remembered through understanding rather than through transcription. "Ready?" he said to Serena. "Ready as I've been every time someone's asked me that for 6 months," she said. "So, guardedly." "Fair." He looked at the equipment settings. "Rosa's going to run the stimulation sequence at half amplitude to start. I want your feedback in real time, not what you think I want to hear, just what's actually happening." "That's never been a problem for me." "I know. That's why I said it to you instead of some people I could name." Rosa initialized the sequence. The resync platform hummed to life, the nerve stimulation protocol beginning at the modified targeting coordinates Ethan had input based on the corrected positioning. Serena sat with her hands on the armrests and her eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance, the expression of someone trying to be a clear channel for sensation without adding to it. 30 seconds in, she said, "It's different." "Different how?" "The signal it's lower, further down. The burning in my back isn't there." He looked at the monitoring readouts. "That's the shoulder correction. What about lower? Hips, thighs, anything?" She was quiet. He watched her face. He'd gotten good at reading her face over these few days. It had a quality of compression, of keeping things held until she was sure of them, and the compression was loosening slightly now, something working through it that she was trying to accurately identify before she named it. "Left thigh," she said slowly. It's not movement. It's more like pressure, but it's in a different place than usual." "Where?" "Inside, like the sensation is coming from inside the muscle instead of from the skin." He wrote it down. "Keep going," he said. "Don't move anything yet. Just feel." The sequence ran for 8 minutes. At 4 minutes, Serena said the pressure sensation had spread to her knee. At 6 minutes, she inhaled sharply. "What?" Ethan said. "My foot." Her voice had changed. The compression was gone entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that he recognized not as excitement, but as the specific shock of something you'd stopped believing in making an unexpected reappearance. "There's something in my foot." Rosa looked at Ethan. He kept his face neutral because he needed her to keep describing rather than reacting to his reaction. "Describe it," he said. It's the feeling of a foot. I know that sounds stupid, but I've had that foot for 30 years, and I know what it feels like when it's there, and it's there right now." She stopped. "Ethan, I hear you. This hasn't happened. In 6 months, this hasn't. I know." He checked the settings again, checked the position indicators, checked everything that was checkable. Everything was where it should be. "Can you try to move your toes?" "Don't force it. Just send the signal and see if anything happens." The room was very quiet. Her right foot moved first, not the toes, just the faintest shift at the ball of the foot, a motion so small that if he hadn't been watching for it, he might have called it involuntary. Then the left foot. The big toe, definitively, in a movement that was small and slow and completely unmistakable. Rosa made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The involuntary kind. Serena was crying. She wasn't making noise about it. The tears were just there, running down her face while her expression stayed almost calm, the way people cried when they'd been holding something back for so long that the release was quiet rather than explosive. She was watching her own feet with an expression Ethan didn't have a word for. Not joy, exactly. Something more like recognition, like meeting something that had gone away and come back. He set down the pen. He sat on the low stool beside her and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that was better than what was happening, and he'd learned the hard way that words had a way of landing on top of important moments and flattening them. After a while, she said, "You were right. The theory was right. You gave me the information to build it from." "Don't do that," she said. Don't give it away." He looked at her. Her eyes were still wet. She was still watching her feet, as if the looking itself was part of keeping it real. "Okay," he said. "The theory was right." She laughed. It was a real laugh this time. Uneven and a little rough and completely genuine. The kind that comes from a place below the place where you make decisions about how you're presenting yourself. Rosa laughed too, a startled, sympathetic laugh, pressing her hand over her mouth. Outside, the city carried on in its usual state of comprehensive indifference. Inside, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, not in any way that could be called a resolution. The movements were tiny. The road ahead was long. Ethan knew that better than anyone in the room, but the signal was getting through. After 6 months of landing in the wrong place, it had found its way home. Patterson came back into the room 45 minutes later, having apparently been notified by someone, and stood in the doorway looking at Serena and at the readouts and at the modified cradle assembly, and at Ethan sitting on the stool with his notebook, and for a long time he didn't say anything. Then he said, "The hip angle." "The hip angle," Ethan confirmed. Patterson nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man updating an internal model he'd been confident in. It was not a comfortable nod. Ethan didn't imagine it would be. "What's your protocol going forward?" Patterson asked. "For the therapy progression." "I'll need your documentation on the full resync stimulation sequence," Ethan said. "And I want to talk to Rosa about the physical therapy component, because the mechanical correction is only part of it. Her body still needs to rebuild the neural pathways." He paused. "I'll also need to modify the nighttime positioning support. The issue isn't just the rig, it's how the compression was occurring during rest as well." Patterson was quiet for another moment. "I can pull the documentation," he said, "and there are some secondary system parameters I never had a reason to adjust that might be relevant to the new positioning. I'd want to go through them with you." "All right." Patterson looked at Serena. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm glad the session went well." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Patterson. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't camaraderie, but it was the beginning of something functional, which was all that the moment required." Gerald Wynne arrived at 2 in the afternoon, traffic apparently resolved, and stood in the doorway of the main room looking at the monitoring data that Rosa was entering into the progress system. and at Serena, who was in the middle of a second stimulation sequence and concentrating hard on the sensation in her left foot, and at Ethan, who was cross-referencing the live readouts against his handwritten notes with the focused quiet of a man who was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Wynne stood there for a while without speaking. Then he found Douglas in the kitchen. "Get me the file on Brooks," he said. "His full background. Everything." Douglas looked at him. "Is there a concern?" "Just get it," Wynne said. And something in his voice was not the controlled patience of a man waiting for events to catch up to his conclusion. It was something more complicated than that. The file Douglas pulled on Ethan Brooks was thin. That was the first thing Wynne noticed when it arrived in his inbox that evening. Not what was in it, but how little there was. A business registration for Brooks Mobile Repair, filed 7 years ago in Millbrook County. Tax records showing income that fluctuated between modest and alarming depending on the year, with a significant drop corresponding to roughly 4 years back. A daughter listed as a dependent. No criminal record, no civil judgments. A brief credit history that told the story of a man who paid what he could when he could, and occasionally couldn't. No educational credentials beyond a high school diploma. No professional certifications in rehabilitation engineering, biomedical technology, or any adjacent field. Wynne sat with his reading glasses on and the file open on his laptop and kept coming back to that last part, because what he was looking at in the file was a man who had, apparently from nothing, produced a mechanical analysis that 6 months of credentialed specialists had missed. And that gap, between what the file said Ethan Brooks was and what Ethan Brooks had just done, was wide enough to be uncomfortable. He sent a one-line message to a contact he maintained at a background verification firm. He asked for a deeper search. He didn't explain why, because Wynne rarely explained his instincts until they proved useful. Ethan didn't know about the file. He was in his garage at 10:30 at night, adjusting the nighttime positioning support he'd mentioned to Patterson, working with the methodical focus of someone who had accepted that sleep was a negotiation rather than a right. The session results from that afternoon had been real and measurable and had produced, in their modest scope, exactly what he'd predicted they would, which should have felt like enough for one day. It didn't, quite, because he knew that one good session was a proof of concept, not a resolution. Serena's nervous system had received a correct signal for the first time in 6 months. What her body did with that signal going forward depended on 100 variables he couldn't control. The state of the neural pathways, the consistency of the therapy protocol, the degree to which the damage from the original injury had been compounding during the months of misaligned treatment. He'd fixed the mechanism. He couldn't guarantee the outcome. He'd been honest about that with her, and she'd said she understood, and he believed that she did. But understanding something intellectually and living inside it were different exercises, and he knew from his own experience that the distance between them was where most of the damage happened. His phone rang at 11. He almost didn't answer it. The number wasn't one he recognized, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Brooks." The voice was measured, professional, with the particular quality of someone who made calls like this often enough to have developed a script for them. "My name is Rebecca Lorne. I'm an attorney representing the interests of several board members at Whitmore Biotech." He set down the tool in his hand. "Okay. I'll be direct. There are members of the board who are prepared to seek a formal injunction preventing your continued access to Ms. Whitmore and to the company's rehabilitation equipment on the grounds that you are practicing without licensure in a medical-adjacent context." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Practicing medicine? I adjusted a piece of hardware." The legal definition of what constitutes unlicensed medical practice is broader than most people realize, Mr. Brooks, and in this context, does Serena know about this call? A brief pause. "Ms. Whitmore is a party to a board process that—" "Does she know?" he said again, more quietly. The pause was longer this time. "This call is being made prior to any formal board action." "So no." He picked up the tool again, turned it in his hand. "Ms. Lorne, I appreciate the directness. I want to be direct back. I made a mechanical correction to a rehabilitation device based on observations about the patient's body that the existing team had missed. The patient, who is also the company's CEO and the person who authorized my access, experienced measurable improvement today for the first time in 6 months." He set the tool down again. "If the board wants to pursue an injunction, that's their right. But I'd think carefully about the optics of using legal process to stop the first thing that's worked. Another pause. When she spoke again, the script quality was slightly diminished. I'm conveying the board's position, Mr. Brooks, not my own recommendation. I understand. Thank you for the call. He hung up and stood in the cold garage for a while. The shop lights hummed. Outside, Millbrook was doing what Millbrook did after 11, which was essentially nothing, the town having made its peace with its own smallness in a way that Ethan had always found either comforting or suffocating depending on the state of his finances. He called Serena. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she was still awake, which told him the day had left her too activated to sleep, which he understood. A lawyer called me, he said. A beat of silence. Then, Rebecca Lorne. You knew. I found out 20 minutes ago. Douglas told me. Her voice had the compressed quality he'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was managing something. I'm dealing with it. How? By making it very clear to the 3 board members driving this that if they proceed with an injunction, I will exercise my standing as majority shareholder to call an emergency vote on board composition. A pause. Which is a thing I can do, which they know I can do, which means they're currently deciding how much they actually want this fight. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant card to play. It is. You sure you want to play it for me? The silence that followed was slightly different. Not the managed kind, but the kind where a person was being honest with themselves about something before they were honest with someone else. I'm playing it for the work, she said finally, and for what the work means. And also, yes, somewhat for you. Those things don't have to be in competition. He didn't have an answer for that. He wasn't sure one was required. Get some sleep, she said. I need you functional tomorrow. You too. I'm working on it. He went inside. Lily was actually asleep this time. He checked, because he'd learned not to assume. And he stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. She slept with her arm thrown over her face in a way that looked uncomfortable and apparently wasn't, because she'd been doing it since she was 3. He didn't understand it. He'd stopped questioning it. He went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about injunctions and board votes and nerve pathways and the sound. Serena's voice had made when she said, "It's there right now," about her foot. He didn't sleep for a long time. Well, the injunction didn't come. Whatever Serena said to the 3 board members, and she never told him exactly, and he didn't ask, it was apparently sufficient. Douglas arrived at the penthouse the following morning with the careful expression of someone who has witnessed a small war conclude and is not entirely sure who won, and informed Ethan that the board had agreed to a 30-day evaluation period during which he would have full access to continue the work. 30 days, Ethan said, with weekly progress reports submitted to Marcus Elroy. Fine. And Patterson will be formally co-supervising the technical protocol. Ethan looked up from the workbench. Is that Patterson's request or the board's? The board's. Does Patterson know? He was informed this morning. Douglas paused. He didn't object. Ethan thought about Patterson sitting on the stool the day before, watching the readouts, updating his model. That's fine too, he said. Patterson's useful if he's actually looking. Douglas made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, which was the closest he ever got to expressing an opinion. The 30 days began. Well, what happened in those 30 days was not, in any cinematic sense, a transformation. It was messier than that, slower, more frustrating, with more setbacks than Ethan had wanted to account for, and more progress than the board had expected to see. The corrected positioning worked. That was established and held across repeated sessions. Serena's nervous system consistently responded to the stimulation sequence when the hardware was properly aligned, and the response was measurable in ways that Patterson's documentation protocols could record and verify. That part was solid. That part was not the problem. The problem was that 6 months of misaligned treatment had consequences. The nerve pathways that should have been rebuilding during those months had instead been receiving signals that landed slightly wrong, and the body's response to a signal that lands slightly wrong, repeated hundreds of times, is not neutral. It had developed compensation patterns, ways of organizing itself around the failure that were now embedded deeply enough to take serious work to undo. The physiotherapy was brutal in the way that useful things are sometimes brutal. Rosa managed it with a thoroughness that Ethan respected, adapting her approach as Serena's responses shifted session by session. He watched when he could and stayed out of the way when he should, and the three of them, him, Rosa, Patterson increasingly, developed something that wasn't quite a team but was at least a functional working arrangement, which in Ethan's experience was often more durable than actual team feeling. Serena had good days and bad days, and the bad days were bad in ways that had nothing to do with medical metrics. They were bad the way that being 30 years old and having to fight for every millimeter of your own body's cooperation is bad. A specific private despair that sat below the competence and the board calls and the CEO-ness of everything, and that she was not, to her credit, very good at hiding from him by this point. On one of those days, day 19 of the 30, a Tuesday again, which Ethan noted without mentioning, she came out of the therapy session and sat very still for a long time and didn't say anything, and Rosa caught Ethan's eye and quietly left the room. After a while, Serena said, "I keep waiting for it to feel like progress." "It is progress." "I know that. I can read the charts. I'm talking about something else." She looked at her hands. "There's this thing that happens when you've been fighting for something long enough. You forget what it felt like before you were fighting, and then the fighting is all there is." He thought about that. He thought about 4 years ago, about a marriage that had ended not dramatically, but incrementally, each small failure compounding until there was nothing left to compound, and about the specific exhaustion of fighting for something that had already decided to be over. He thought about Lily at age 4, sitting in the back seat of his truck while he drove away from the house where they'd lived as a family, asking him where they were going, and him saying somewhere good because it was the only honest thing he had. "Yeah," he said, "I know that thing." She looked at him. He didn't expand on it, and she didn't push, but something shifted in the quality of the silence. It became less separate. "Does it get better?" she asked. "The fighting feeling?" "Any of it." "It gets different," he said, "which is not the same as better, but eventually starts to feel like it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a terrible answer." "It's the true one." "I know." She almost smiled. "I've noticed that's your specialty." It was on day 23 that Gerald Wynn's background search came back. Ethan didn't know about it directly. What he knew was that Douglas appeared in the doorway of the main room at 10 in the morning, looking like a man who had been handed information. He did not know how to categorize, and that he asked Ethan if they could speak privately, and that they went to the study, Serena's study, with its wall of books that were actually read, and its desk that was perpetually covered in more paper than a paperless company should generate. And Douglas closed the door and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. "We ran a background verification," Douglas said. "Standard procedure when someone has extended access to Ms. Whitmore." "Okay." The initial check was clean. The more thorough search found some additional history. Douglas looked at him steadily. "You were a graduate researcher at Harlow Institute of Biomedical Engineering. You completed a doctoral program in biomechanical systems engineering 14 years ago. You filed 7 patents in the field of adaptive rehabilitation technology between 14 and 10 years ago." He paused. 3 of those patents formed the core intellectual architecture of the original Resync platform. The study was very quiet. "The company acquired those patents through an intermediary licensing firm 8 years ago," Douglas continued. "The acquisition was for a sum significantly below market value, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement signed by the original holder." Another pause. The original holder was listed as E. Brooks, identified only by that initial and surname. Ethan looked at the bookshelves. He'd noticed the books on his first day in the study, noticed them the way he noticed things, cataloging without deciding what the information meant yet. There was a copy of a biomechanical engineering text on the 3rd shelf that he'd used in graduate school. "How much does Serena know?" he asked. "Nothing yet. I came to you first." Douglas's voice was careful in a way that wasn't concealing anything. It was the careful of someone who was genuinely uncertain about the right move. "Mr. Brooks, I need to understand what I'm looking at here." Ethan sat down in the chair near the window. He sat heavily, not dramatically, just the weight of a thing that had been carried for a long time, settling into a room where it hadn't been before. "My wife got sick," he said. 4 years into the patents. It wasn't fast and it wasn't cheap, and the research grant funding had dried up, and I was working independently by then, and the institute that had backed the original work had dissolved. I needed money. He looked at the window. Someone found me. A licensing firm, like you said. They knew what the patents were worth. They offered me a number that would cover treatment costs and leave enough to not be nothing. He paused. The NDA was a condition. I signed it. The treatment, Douglas said quietly. She died anyway. He said it without expression, not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd said it enough times in enough context that the words had developed a kind of protective casing around themselves. 2 years after I signed, Lily was 3. Douglas was still standing with his hands in his pockets. His face had lost its professional neutrality, not into anything dramatic, just into something more honest. The Resync platform, he said. You built it. The original architecture, yes. The company did the engineering development, the manufacturing, the commercial build-out. That's real work, and I'm not dismissing it. He looked at Douglas. But the core mechanical principles, the nerve pathway targeting model, the adaptive positioning framework, those came from my research. And you've been watching the platform fail to help someone for weeks. I've been watching it fail to help someone because nobody bothered to look at how the patient's body actually sat in the machine. He said it quietly, without bitterness. Or mostly without. The engineering is good. The implementation protocol assumed a standardized patient that doesn't exist. Douglas took his hands out of his pockets. He looked at the door, then back at Ethan. She needs to know. I know. How do you want to handle it? Ethan thought about this. He thought about Serena in the therapy session, about it gets different, which is not the same as better, about the way she'd almost smiled at him and called honesty his specialty. I'll tell her, he said. Not you, not the board, me. When? When the session is finished today. Not before. I don't want this in the room while she's working. Douglas nodded. He moved toward the door, stopped. Mr. Brooks, the NDA you signed, there are implications. Legal ones regarding your role here, your access to the system, the work you've been doing. I know. The company's legal team is going to want to I know, he said again. One thing at a time. The session that afternoon was one of the better ones. Serena moved her left foot through a controlled range of motion that Rosa measured at 30% of full voluntary capacity, a number that sounded modest and was, in context, remarkable. The sensation mapping had expanded. The compensation patterns were loosening in specific areas that Patterson had identified in the data and that corresponded to what Ethan had expected based on the corrected stimulation alignment. Patterson said very little during the session. He'd been saying less in general, which Ethan had noticed meant he was processing more, which was different from the folded arms silence of the early days. When Rosa was wrapping up the session notes and Patterson was logging the system data, Ethan looked at Serena and said, Can we talk? Just the two of us. She looked at him. She read things in faces quickly. It was a skill you developed when you ran a company, the ability to identify the specific texture of incoming information before it arrived. What she read in his face made her say, calmly, Rosa, we're done for today. Thank you. When the room emptied, she looked at him and waited. He told her. Told it the way he told most things, directly, without preamble, without softening it beyond what accuracy required. He told her about the doctoral program, the research, the 7 patents. He told her about his wife, about the licensing firm, about the NDA and the number that had covered the treatment costs and the 2 years that followed and Lily at 3 in the back seat of his truck. He told her that the core architecture of the machine she'd built her company around had come out of a garage not unlike the one he worked in now, 14 years ago, when he was 22, and thought that what mattered was the work. She listened the way she listened, completely, without interruption, her face doing the compression thing that he now knew meant she was holding it carefully before she responded. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Why didn't you say anything? She asked. When you first came in? Because it wasn't relevant to whether I could help you. Ethan, I mean that. He looked at her directly. If I'd walked in and said hello, I'm the guy who invented the original system your company built into a product. The conversation becomes about that. And then nothing gets done and you're still in the same position you've been in for 6 months. And now? Now something's been done. He looked at his hands. And now you know. She was quiet again. He could see her working through it, the layers of it, what it meant for the company, what it meant for him, what it meant for the NDA and the legal territory Douglas had flagged. And underneath all of that, the simple human fact of what he'd given up and what it had and hadn't saved. "Your wife," she said. "Her name was Claire. I'm sorry. Thank you." She looked at the resync platform in the corner, at the modified cradle assembly that had become, in the past weeks, the difference between movement and no movement. "You built that," she said. Not a question. "The first version of it, 14 years ago. And you watched us get it wrong for 6 months. I watched a very expensive and technically proficient team apply a correct system to incorrect parameters," he said, "which is different from the system being wrong." She looked at him. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate." A long pause. Outside, the city was doing its late afternoon thing, the light going amber through the windows, the skyline beginning its transition into something that looked more intentional than it was. "The board is going to lose their minds," she said. "Probably. Marcus is going to want a full legal review of your engagement, the NDA, the patent history. I know. Gerald Wynn is going to say he knew something was off." She almost smiled. He did know something was off. He just didn't know what. "He's not wrong to be thorough." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of looking that was actually an assessment, the way she'd been assessing things since he walked in with the toolbox, but different now because the information set had changed. "What do you want?" she asked. "In what sense?" "In any sense. From this. From the company. You invented the core of a technology that generated $4 billion in value, and you signed it away for what I'm guessing was a fraction of that under circumstances that were not fair." "The circumstances were what they were," he said. "I don't spend a lot of time on fair." "That doesn't mean you're not entitled to—" "Serena." He said her name the way he said most things, without decoration. "What I want is for the work to be finished. What I want is to make sure the protocol we've developed here gets documented properly, so it doesn't get lost when I'm not in the room anymore. What I want—" He stopped, recalibrated, started again. "I have an idea for what should happen with this. Not with the legal stuff, that'll go where it goes, but with the work itself." She waited. "There should be a center," he said, "not a corporate rehabilitation division, not a premium product tier. An actual center where people who can't afford what you charge for the resync system can get the same quality of care. Veterans, kids, people who got hurt and don't have the right insurance and end up with whatever's available instead of what actually works." He looked at his hands again. "I've been doing informal versions of that out of my garage for 8 years, keeping old equipment running for people who couldn't afford new. It's not enough. It was never enough. But it's what I had." The room was very quiet. "That's what you want," she said. "That's what I think should happen with whatever comes out of this." She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the foot that moved, that first day, with the expression that was not joy exactly, but recognition, like finding something that had been misplaced for long enough that you'd half stopped looking. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I said okay, Ethan. I heard you." She looked toward the window. "Let me deal with the board first. The legal review, the NDA, all of it. That's going to take some time and it's going to be messy, and Marcus is going to use his formal voice for at least 2 full meetings." A pause. "But after that?" "After that," he said, "we'll build it." He looked at her. He was not a man who defaulted to trust. Life had given him specific reasons for that, and he respected the reasons even when they were inconvenient. But he looked at her sitting there with her hands on the armrests, and her eyes steady, and her voice carrying the quality of a person who meant what they said in the specific way that came from having learned what the alternative cost, and he found that he believed her. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He did what he usually did with things he wasn't sure about. He set it aside carefully, where he could find it again later, and went back to the work. "The secondary nerve pathway," he said, picking up his notebook. "Patterson flagged something in the data from today's session. I want to go through it before tomorrow." Serena blinked. Then she made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Right now." "The legal drama will still be there tomorrow. The data is best looked at fresh." She shook her head, but she held out her hand for the notebook. He gave it to her, and she looked at Patterson's flagged section, and they went through it together in the amber light while the city moved outside and the weight of everything that had just been said settled into the room like sediment, slow and permanent and harder to see than it was to feel. The workbench in the corner, the modified cradle assembly, sat in its corrected configuration. It was not beautiful. It was made from salvaged materials and hand-cut components and the specific ingenuity of a man who'd spent years solving problems with whatever was actually present rather than whatever was theoretically ideal. It looked exactly like what it was, and it worked. After everything, it worked. That was the part Ethan kept coming back to on the drive home that night, on the highway back to Millbrook with the radio still broken and the alternator still nursing itself along. The work worked. Whatever came next, the legal review, the board, the NDA, Wynn, and Marcus, and all the formal voices that were going to fill all the formal meetings, the work had already done what it needed to do. He got home. Lily was at the kitchen table doing homework, her tongue pressed against her teeth in the way she did when the math was annoying her. She looked up when he came in. "How's the lady?" she said. "Better," he said. "Getting better." Lily considered this. "Did you tell her about the cat thing again?" "We got into some other topics tonight." "You should tell her. She probably wants a cat and doesn't know it yet." He washed his hands at the sink. "You might be right." "I'm usually right," she said, and went back to the math. He stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the small window above it at the dark backyard, at nothing in particular. He was tired in the way that came from a day that had asked more than it was supposed to. But underneath the tired was something else, something he didn't try to name because naming things had a way of making them fragile. He dried his hands and went to help Lily with the math. The legal review took 11 days. 11 days during which Ethan continued coming to the penthouse every morning, continued working with Rosa and Patterson on the therapy protocol, continued making small adjustments to the hardware as Serena's body told him what it needed. The legal process happened in a parallel universe that occasionally sent tremors into the real one. A call Douglas had to take, a document Serena needed to sign, a meeting that pulled her away for 2 hours and left her quieter than usual when she came back. Marcus Elroy used his formal voice for exactly 2 full meetings, as predicted. Gerald Wynn said he'd known something was off. Also as predicted, the NDA review was the complicated part. The original agreement had been drawn up by the licensing intermediary, a firm called Meridian IP Holdings that had since dissolved, its principals dispersed into other ventures, its records existing in a legal state that one of Serena's attorneys described as aggressively ambiguous. The NDA had prohibited Ethan from publicly claiming authorship of the patents or from engaging in competitive development of substantially similar technology. Whether his work at the penthouse constituted a violation of that second clause was, apparently, a question that required 3 attorneys, 2 weeks, and a significant number of billable hours to answer. The answer, when it came, was no. Barely. The corrective work he'd done on the resync system was classified as maintenance and improvement of existing technology rather than competitive development, a distinction thin enough to be uncomfortable but legally sufficient. Serena's lead attorney delivered this conclusion with the expression of someone who had threaded a needle in poor lighting and wasn't entirely sure the thread would hold. What was not legally ambiguous, what was in fact the clearest finding of the entire review, was that the original patent acquisition had been conducted at a price the attorneys characterized as substantially below fair market value, and that the circumstances of that acquisition, specifically the personal and financial distress of the seller at the time, raised questions the company's legal team seemed genuinely uncomfortable sitting with. Serena read the full report on a Thursday morning, alone in her study. When she came out, she found Ethan in the main room going through session data with Patterson, and she said, "Can I have a few minutes?" Patterson gathered his things with the efficiency of a man who had learned to read the room. When he was gone, Serena set the report on the table between them. "The attorneys found what Douglas found," she said, "and more. I figured they would." "The acquisition price." She looked at him directly. "Ethan, then, they paid you less than 4% of what those patents were worth at market value at the time of acquisition." He looked at the report. "The number covered what I needed it to cover." "That's not a defense of the number." "I know." He looked up. "I'm not defending it. I'm saying I knew what I was signing. I was making a decision under specific circumstances, and I made it. I don't spend a lot of energy trying to revise my own history." That's admirable and also slightly maddening, she said. I've heard that before. She sat back. The company didn't conduct the acquisition. Meridian did. But the patents came to us through Meridian and what Meridian did to get them. She paused. I didn't know. I want to be clear about that. When I built on that technology, I believed the IP was cleanly acquired. I believe you. Do you? He considered it, which was a thing she'd come to expect from him. He didn't confirm things reflexively. He actually checked before he confirmed. Yes, he said. You're not a person who would have been comfortable with how that deal was structured. It would have bothered you. It's bothering me now. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I want to make it right. Not because the attorneys told me I had to, because it's the right thing and I have the ability to do it. She folded her hands on the table. The company will make a payment to you representing the difference between what you received and a fair market valuation of the patents at acquisition. Our financial team is working on the exact figure, but it's not a small number, Ethan. He didn't say anything. Additionally, she continued, I'd like to offer you a formal role with the company. Chief Technology Officer, oversight of all rehabilitation engineering development. Full resources, full team, the ability to direct research toward what you believe matters. She paused. And the Rehabilitation Center. That's not contingent on the role. That's separate. That's already in motion. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not the honest face she'd come to know, but something more internal, something he was working through before he brought it to the surface. The CTO role, he said. I appreciate it. But I can't do it. She was quiet, waiting. I've thought about this. He picked up a pen from the table, turned it in his hand, set it down. The corporate structure, the board, the quarterly reviews, the liability framework, the 17 levels of sign-off before you can change a design parameter. I know that's how a real company functions at scale, and I respect that it works. But I'm not good in that structure. I've tried to be, and I'm not. He looked at her. I'd spend all my time in meetings trying to explain to people who have MBAs why the measurement on a patient's hip matters more than the industry standard specification. And they'd spend all their time trying to explain to me why we can't deviate from the standard specification without a 14-month regulatory process. And we'd both be right, and nothing would get done. She looked at him for a long time. That's an honest answer. It's the only one I had. What do you want, then, in terms of a role? The center, he said. Lead inventor. My own lab within the center structure. Small, specific, focused on the cases that the standard system misses. I work with whoever needs to be worked with on regulatory and documentation, but the design work is mine and the approach is mine. He paused. And I want to be able to bring in young engineers, people who haven't learned yet to stop looking at the patient. Serena was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him. Claire would have liked that, she said, what you just described. He went very still. Douglas told me her name, she said. I hope that's okay. I looked up what I could find about her. A pause. She was a pediatric occupational therapist. For 11 years, his voice was even. She was good at it. She would have understood what you're building. Yeah. He looked at the window. She would have had opinions about the patient intake process. She always had opinions about intake processes. A small pause. She was usually right. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms when two people have arrived somewhere real and are taking a moment to acknowledge it without making it into more than it is. The center, Serena said finally. We build it your way. Your money, he said. Your company's support. That's not nothing. You'll have input. I'll have input on the building and the funding structure and the organizational framework. She met his eyes. The work is yours. The following months were not a montage. They were long and sometimes tedious and full of the specific friction that comes from trying to build something real rather than something theoretical, which is to say they were full of zoning permits and contractor disputes and a structural engineering report that came back requiring a foundation revision that added 6 weeks and a number Serena's finance director called painful and that Ethan called the cost of doing it right. The physical therapy continued in parallel. Serena's progress was genuine and non-linear, which is the only kind of genuine progress there is. She had weeks where the improvements compounded, where Rosa's measurements showed consistent gains across multiple indicators, and the neural pathway mapping expanded in ways that Patterson documented with a focus that had quietly transformed over the months from professional obligation into something closer to investment. And she had weeks where the progress plateaued, where her body seemed to consolidate rather than advance, and where the plateau felt indistinguishable from a ceiling even when the data said otherwise. On one of those plateau weeks, she threw something. It was a coffee mug, empty, she would clarify later, as if this were a meaningful distinction. And it hit the wall of the therapy room and left a mark that Rosa's expression suggested was not the first mark that room had seen. Ethan was there. He picked up the pieces without comment, set them on the window ledge in a way that acknowledged what had happened without dramatizing it, and said, "You want to take the day off?" "No," she said. Her voice had the roughness that came after anger. Not apologetic exactly, just reduced, the armor thinner for a moment. "Okay," he sat down across from her. "Then let's talk about what happened in the left hip sequence today, because I want to adjust the timing interval, and I want your feedback on whether you think that's the right call." She looked at him. "I just threw a mug at the wall." "I noticed." You're frustrated. The frustration is accurate. The progress is also real." He held her gaze. "Both of those things are true at the same time, and the mug was empty so nobody got hurt, and now we have work to do if you're up for it." She stared at him for a moment. Then she said with the rough edges still in her voice, "I hate how reasonable you are sometimes. It's a consistent complaint. Do you ever just lose it, get angry, break something?" He thought about it. "I punched a wall once," he said. "About 4 years ago. Hurt my hand. Lily asked me why my hand was bandaged, and I told her I'd hit it on the workbench, and she said I should be more careful, and I said I would be." He paused. "I've been more careful." She almost laughed. It didn't quite make it all the way to a laugh, but it got close, and the room felt lighter for it. "Did it help? The punching?" "Not really, but I understood why I did it. So in that sense, yes." She looked at her hands. "I don't like needing this much patience," she said. "I'm not a patient person. I've never been a patient person. I built a company that runs on speed and decisiveness. And now I'm sitting here celebrating that my big toe moved 3 more degrees than last week and trying to convince myself it counts. It counts. I know it counts. I just hate that I need it to." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture he had when he was saying something he'd thought about rather than something reflexive. "When Lily was learning to read," he said, "she got stuck on a specific thing. The way certain letters reverse, B and D, P and Q, she'd get them right, then wrong, then right again, and she couldn't understand why her brain wouldn't just fix it permanently once she'd fixed it once." He paused. "She cried about it, actually, which she doesn't do often. She said it felt like the floor kept moving." Serena was listening. "I told her the floor wasn't moving. The floor was always the same. It was her feet that were getting steadier." He sat back. It didn't help immediately. She still mixed them up for another 2 months. But she stopped expecting that getting it right once would mean getting it right forever, and that made the in-between parts easier to be inside. A long quiet. Serena looked at the mark on the wall where the mug had hit. "You're annoyingly good at that," she said. "At what?" "Finding the version of a thing that lands." He shrugged. "I've had a lot of practice with an 8-year-old. "She'd be good at this," Serena said. "Lily. She should think about rehabilitation work. She wants to be a marine biologist. Kids change their minds." She's been consistent about the marine biology for 3 years, which in 8-year-old terms is basically a career commitment. He picked up his notebook. "Shall we look at the hip sequence?" They looked at the hip sequence. The timing interval adjustment was made. The following week, the plateau broke. Lily met Serena on a Saturday in February. It was Ethan's fault, technically, in the sense that he had mentioned to Lily that morning that he needed to go in for a few hours to review some documentation with the construction team that was breaking ground on the center site, and Lily had said she wanted to come, and he'd said the site wasn't ready for visitors, and she'd said she didn't mean the site, and he'd said, "What do you mean then?" And she'd said she meant the lady, with a patience that suggested she'd been building to this ask for some time and was mildly exasperated that he hadn't anticipated it. He called Serena. Serena said to bring her. Lily wore her good jacket, which was red with a hood and had a small whale embroidered on the breast pocket, a detail she'd added herself with a kit she'd gotten for her birthday. She carried a book about deep-sea fish because she'd been in the middle of it and saw no reason to stop just because she was going somewhere. In the elevator, she looked at Ethan and said, "Does she know I'm coming?" I called ahead. "Does she know I've been thinking about her?" "I didn't tell her that part." Lily nodded as though this was reasonable. When the elevator opened and they walked into the penthouse and Serena was there in the main room, Lily stopped in the doorway for a moment and did the quiet processing thing, her eyes going slightly unfocused, and then she walked across the room with the directness of a person who had decided on something. "Hi," she said. "I'm Lily." Serena looked at her. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition of a person she'd been assembling from secondhand information and was now encountering directly, finding that the real thing was more specific than the assembled version. "Hi," she said. "I'm Serena. I know, my dad's been helping you." "He has. He's very good at it." Lily considered this seriously. "He's good at most things," she said, "except cooking. His scrambled eggs are bad." "Lily," Ethan said. "They are, though." She turned back to Serena. "Do you have a cat yet?" "Still no cat." Lily shook her head. "You should get one. They're good when things are hard. My friend Maya has one and it just sits with her when she's sad. It doesn't do anything. It just stays." Serena looked at the child for a moment. "That sounds nice." "It is." Lily held up the book. "Do you want to see? I'm at the part about anglerfish. They're extremely weird and I love them." Serena made the sound that was by now fully evolved into a real laugh. Warm and slightly unguarded and entirely genuine. "Yeah," she said. "Show me." Lily sat on the floor beside Serena's chair with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who had not yet learned to assign meanings to furniture and opened the book, and began explaining anglerfish with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had found a subject worth explaining properly. Ethan stood near the window and watched them. He was aware of something that he'd been aware of in smaller doses for weeks now, something he'd been handling the way he handled most feelings that complicated his ability to function, setting it aside carefully, somewhere findable, not examining it too directly because the examination had a way of making the feeling larger than was useful. He looked at Lily on the floor and Serena listening with real attention, asking actual questions about the anglerfish, and the feeling declined to be set aside this time. It simply sat there in his chest, solid and uncomfortable and recognizable, and he acknowledged it and didn't know what to do with it and went to make tea, because it was either that or stand at the window being obvious about something he hadn't decided to be obvious about yet. The center broke ground in March. The site was a repurposed industrial building on the east side of the city, chosen because of its footprint and its structural bones, and because the neighborhood had a higher concentration of residents with limited insurance coverage than anywhere else within a reasonable radius of the medical corridor, which Ethan had researched and Serena had confirmed and the board had accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The building had been a small manufacturing facility in a previous life, and Ethan liked that about it, that it had been a place where things were made, where the measure of success was whether something worked. He spent 3 days a week on site during construction, which meant he was also spending 3 days a week in the city, which meant the 40-minute commute had become a fixed part of his schedule rather than an occasional one. He'd gotten the alternator fixed in January. Serena had found out that the truck had been nursing itself along and had said something that wasn't quite offering to pay for it but was in that neighborhood, and he'd declined in a way that wasn't quite gracious. And then she'd said nothing more about it, and 2 weeks later there'd been an invoice from an auto shop addressed to him showing a zero balance. And he'd called her and she'd said the building's contractor had used the shop for fleet maintenance and had negotiating leverage on the rate, and she'd merely made an inquiry, and he'd said that was not what happened, and she'd said he couldn't prove that, and he'd said, "Yes, I can," and she'd said, "Fine. Consider it reimbursement for the months you drove 40 minutes each way in a vehicle that was technically failing," and that had been the end of that. He didn't dislike her for it. I was surprised to find that he didn't mind it at all. The afternoons when he wasn't on site, he was at the penthouse working on the center's technical systems, the patient assessment protocol, the hardware customization framework, the training curriculum for the engineering staff he'd be bringing on. Patterson was involved in this, which Ethan had not initially expected, but which had developed naturally from the working relationship they'd built over the therapy sessions. Patterson was meticulous and conservative and occasionally needed to be pushed past his own caution, and Ethan was not meticulous in Patterson's sense and occasionally needed someone to slow him down before he outpaced the documentation. They had figured out, without discussing it, how to use these differences rather than be obstructed by them. On an afternoon in April, Patterson and Ethan were going through the training curriculum in the study when Serena came in from a 2-hour session with Rosa, looking like someone who had been through something. Not broken. Serena rarely looked broken, but used. Genuinely used, down to the actual resource. She sat in the chair by the window. Patterson looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Serena. "Good session?" he said. "Productive." She set her hand flat on the armrest. "Rosa thinks I might be ready to try standing with the parallel bars next week." The room went quiet in a specific way. Patterson looked at his laptop screen. Ethan set his pen down. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think I'm terrified." She said it matter-of-factly, which was the only way she said things that scared her, as if the matter-of-fact delivery could neutralize the fear without eliminating it. "I know the data. I know where my muscle response is. I know that Rosa's judgment on these things is better than mine." She looked out the window. "But knowing those things and not being terrified are two different states." "Yeah," he said. "I stood up in that boardroom 4 years ago and told 12 people that the company's core product line had a fatal design flaw, and I was pulling it for 8 months for a complete rebuild, and I was less scared than I am right now." A pause. "Which says something about me that I'm still working out." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You want to know what I think?" I asked. "I think the board presentation was scary because of what other people might do. What Rosa's proposing is scary because of what your own body might do." He picked the pen back up, tapped it once on the table. "That's a different kind of scary. It doesn't have anything to hide behind." She was quiet. Patterson, to his credit, was very still and making no sounds at all. "You'll be there?" she said. Not fragile, just direct. In the way she was direct about things she actually needed. "I'll be there." She nodded. That was the end of it. She pulled her laptop onto the table and opened a document, which was Serena's version of drawing the curtain on a moment. Patterson caught Ethan's eye and gave him a look that was small and specific. The look of a person who had watched something from a slight distance and understood more of it than he was going to acknowledge out loud. Ethan looked back at his notebook and kept his face neutral. He was getting less good at the neutral face. He'd noticed this and wasn't sure what to do about it. The standing attempt happened on a Thursday. The parallel bars had been installed in the therapy room a week earlier, floor-mounted, solid, set at the correct height for Serena's measurements, which were Ethan's measurements and which were by now very precise. Rosa had briefed Ethan and Patterson on the plan, on what success would look like, and what a useful partial outcome would look like, and how to handle it if neither of those things happened. Douglas was there. He'd asked, and Serena had said yes in the way that suggested she wanted him there, which was different from how she normally managed Douglas's presence. And Douglas had arrived that morning in a suit that was slightly less charcoal than his usual one, which Ethan suspected was his version of the occasion. Lily was at school. Ethan had told her what was happening, and she'd said, "Tell her good luck," and he'd said, "I will." Rosa ran a standard warm-up protocol first, 30 minutes of the stimulation sequence in the corrected positioning, the measurements all checking where they should be, the neural pathway response at the level that had become their reliable baseline over the past months. Serena sat through it with a stillness that was not quite calm but was its functional equivalent, the stillness of a person who has decided to be present for something they can't entirely control. When Rosa finished the sequence, she looked at Serena. "Ready to move to the bars?" "No," Serena said. "But let's go." The transfer to the parallel bars was slow and careful, and took 3 minutes that felt longer. Rosa managed it from one side, Ethan from the other, and his hands were on her ribcage and shoulder, and he was aware of her breathing, the deliberate quality of it, the way she was using breath to stay in the present rather than the anticipation. She was upright. Not standing, upright, leaning forward over the bars, her hands gripping them, her feet flat on the floor in the position Rosa had specified. "Okay," Rosa said. "We're going to try to shift some weight into your feet, slowly. Don't force it." "I know," Serena said. "I know. I know you know, Rosa said. I said it anyway. Serena almost smiled. She looked down at her feet. Ethan watched her face because her face would tell him things before the monitoring equipment did. The weight shift was gradual, managed, Rosa talking her through it in a low, steady voice. And then, slowly, unevenly, with a quality that was nothing like the word graceful, but was everything like the word real. Serena Whitmore took weight in her legs for the first time in 9 months. She made a sound. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound that happens when the body experiences something the brain hasn't finished processing yet, when the nervous system reports something back that the mind has been told to stop expecting. Her knuckles were white on the bars. Her shoulders were shaking with the effort. Ethan said nothing. His hand was on her upper back, stable, not pushing, just there. I'm standing, she said. Her voice was rough. I'm standing. You're standing, Rosa confirmed with a specific professional warmth that Ethan had come to understand was the product of having been through this moment with people before and knowing exactly what it required. Partially, Serena said. I know it's partial. I know the bars are doing, you're taking weight, Ethan said. That's not the bars. She looked at him over her shoulder. She was crying again. The same quiet way as the first time, the tears just there without performance, her face still almost composed. She looked like someone who was furious and grateful and exhausted and relieved and not sure in what order. Douglas, from across the room, made a sound and pressed his hand over his mouth. Serena held the position for 40 seconds before Rosa guided her back down. 40 seconds. Rosa measured it, wrote it down, said it was an excellent first attempt and that they'd build from here. Serena sat in the chair and didn't say anything for a while. Ethan sat beside her the same way he had after the first session with the foot, not filling the space, just occupying it. After a while, she said, Tell Lily. She'll want to hear it from you. Serena looked at him. I don't have her number. I'll give it to you. A pause. You'd let your 8-year-old have a cell phone number for a near stranger? Lily's a good judge of people, he said. She approved of you after the anglerfish conversation. High bar. Very high. She once told a substitute teacher that he was untrustworthy because of his handwriting. He pulled out his phone. She was right, as it turned out. The guy borrowed a student's calculator and never returned it. Serena took the number. She looked at it on her phone screen, and then she looked at Ethan in the way she'd been looking at him more often lately. Directly and without the managed distance that had been there in the beginning, without the corporate layer or the CEO layer, just one person looking at another person and seeing what was actually there. He saw it. I was in the process of figuring out what to do about it, which was slow work, which was the kind of work he did slowly on purpose, because the fast version had a history of costing more than he could afford. Thank you, she said. It was direct and uncomplicated, the way she said things when they mattered most. The work did it, he said. You did it. I know you think that, she said. I know you mean it, but I'm thanking you anyway. He accepted it. He was getting slightly better at that, too. Outside, the city was bright with an April afternoon, the kind of day that didn't promise anything but felt like it was willing to discuss possibilities. The construction on the center was 3 weeks ahead of the revised schedule. Patterson had noted this in the last progress report with something resembling satisfaction. The patient intake framework was written. The first cohort of engineering staff was being interviewed. The thing Ethan had described in Serena's study on a November evening, the thing he'd been doing informally out of his garage for 8 years, was becoming real in a form that could reach people he'd never be able to reach from Millbrook. He thought about Claire, the way he allowed himself to think about her on days that had weight to them. Not with the grief that had been the whole of it in the beginning, but with something that had more room in it, more oxygen. She would have had opinions about the patient intake process. He thought about Lily and her whale jacket and her anglerfish book. He thought about the 40 seconds. Then he picked up his notebook, because there was still work to do and it wasn't going to do itself, and he went back to it. The center opened on a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year and 4 days after the helicopter went down. Nobody planned the timing that way. Serena noticed it 3 weeks before the opening date and mentioned it to Ethan, who looked at the calendar and said, huh, in the way he said things that landed on him unexpectedly, and then neither of them said anything more about it because neither of them needed to. Some coincidences carry their own meaning without being helped. The building had been renamed twice during construction. The first name had been proposed by the board's communications team, something corporate and forgettable, the kind of name that looked good on a press release and meant nothing to anyone who wasn't already invested in the company's branding. Serena had rejected it in 2 sentences. The second name had been Ethan's suggestion, offered quietly one evening while they were going through the final interior specifications, the Brooks Whitmore Rehabilitation Center. Serena had rejected that too, more slowly. Why? He'd asked. Because in 10 years, nobody will know who Brooks and Whitmore were, she said. They'll know what the center does. Name it for that. He'd thought about it. The Pathway Center, he said. She'd looked at him. Why Pathway? Because that's what we're trying to fix. The connection between where the signal starts and where it's supposed to land. He paused. And because it works for everyone who comes through. Veterans, kids, people who got hurt last week or 10 years ago. They're all trying to find a pathway back to something. She'd said yes without deliberating, which was the way she made decisions she didn't need to think twice about. The Pathway Center. It was painted on the building's front in clean sans serif letters, dark on light stone, the kind of signage that was confident without being loud. Ethan had opinions about the font. Lily had stronger opinions about the font and had submitted a handwritten case for a different option that included 3 hand-drawn comparisons. The final choice was a compromise between what Lily preferred and what the signage company could actually produce, which Lily found acceptable, if not entirely satisfying. The morning of the opening, Ethan was at the center by 6. He told himself it was because he wanted to check the equipment installations one last time. The therapy rooms, the patient assessment stations, the lab he'd set up in the East Wing where his engineering team would work on custom hardware. There were 12 engineers on staff, 6 of them recent graduates, 3 of them mid-career people who'd left corporate rehabilitation firms for reasons that each told differently, but that all came down to the same thing. They'd stopped being allowed to actually look at the patient. 2 of the others were veterans themselves, one of whom had been a patient in an informal sense. He'd brought his own prosthetic rig to Ethan's garage in Millbrook 3 years ago, and Ethan had fixed it over a weekend, and they'd talked for 4 hours about what the rig was doing wrong and what it should be doing instead. And the man had remembered that conversation. The 12th engineer was Patterson. That one had surprised Ethan. Patterson had tendered his resignation from Whitmore Biotech in July, which had surprised everyone, and had called Ethan directly to ask about a role at the center, which had surprised Ethan more. They'd had a long conversation about it. Not uncomfortable, just careful, the way conversations are between 2 people who have enough history to know where the complications are. You don't have to do this, Ethan had said. I know that. The company treated you well. The company was fine, Patterson said. I'm just tired of being fine. A pause. You were right. About the notes. About how we were recording what the equipment did instead of what the patient said. He was quiet for a moment. I want to work somewhere that considers those the same thing. Ethan had thought about it for the length of time it took to be honest with himself. Then he'd said yes. So at 6 in the morning, on the day of the opening, he walked through a center that had 12 engineers, a clinical director Rosa had recruited from a veteran rehabilitation network, an administrative team. Serena had built with the same unsparing attention she brought to everything, and a patient wait list that had filled within 72 hours of the application portal going live. He walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his coffee in one hand, checking the things that needed checking and trying not to think too hard about how different the building felt from the garage in Millbrook. It felt different. He'd spent enough time refusing to sentimentalize things to recognize when a feeling was simply accurate, and this was accurate. The garage had been enough, and this was more than enough, and the distance between those 2 things was made of years and loss and work and a helicopter falling out of a clear October sky. He stopped in the main therapy room. 8 stations, each customized to the patient profile from intake assessment, each built on the positioning principles he'd documented from the work with Serena and developed into a replicable methodology with Patterson and the engineering team. The room was quiet and still and smelled like new materials and floor sealant, and in a few hours it would have people in it who had been told there was nothing left to try. He stood there for a while. He thought about being 22 in a different kind of lab, filing a patent application at 2 in the morning, certain that the work would find its way to the people who needed it. He thought about being 28, signing his name at the bottom of a document that sold that certainty away, telling himself it was the right trade because it had to be the right trade. He thought about 8 years in a garage, keeping old equipment running for people who couldn't afford new, telling himself it was enough because it had to be enough. He wasn't 22 anymore. He wasn't 28. He was 32 years old, and the work had found its way, and the path it had taken to get here was not the path he would have designed for it, and he'd stopped trying to revise that fact. It was enough that it had arrived. Serena arrived at 9:30, which was later than she'd planned and earlier than anyone had expected given the morning she'd described to him the night before. A board call that ran long, a press inquiry that required a formal response, her assistant sending 3 increasingly urgent messages about the event timeline. She came through the front doors in Ethan's customized support frame, the refined version, the one they'd developed over 8 months of iteration, lighter than the original and fitted to her current physical profile, which had changed considerably since November. She moved through the lobby with a deliberateness that was nothing like the rigid caution of the early therapy sessions. It was slower than walking. It was also unquestionably her, the posture, the quality of attention, the way she took in a room. She stopped in the lobby and looked around. The space was filling, staff, the first wave of patients and their families, the press contingent that Serena's communications team had carefully managed, some board members, a cluster of people from the Veteran Rehabilitation Network that had provided the original referral that brought Ethan to the penthouse a year ago. Douglas was there. He'd come early enough to have already identified where the coffee station was and positioned himself near it, which Ethan had come to understand was Douglas's version of settling in. Marcus Elroy was there, looking slightly softened from his board meeting version, as if the occasion had permitted a temporary loosening of the formal voice. He found Serena within minutes of her arrival and said something to her that made her nod in a way that was neither warm nor cold, just honest. The nod of a person who has arrived at a working respect that doesn't require being comfortable. Gerald Wynn was not there. He'd sent a formal note of support and a significant private donation, which Serena had accepted and Ethan had accepted as the gesture it was. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement from a man who had understood what he'd been looking at a year ago and been unable to say so. Lily arrived with Mrs. Calloway at 10, wearing the red whale jacket and carrying a small potted succulent she'd bought with her own money because she'd decided Serena needed something living in her office, and a cat was logistically complicated for an opening day gift. She found Serena almost immediately, with the directness she'd shown on their first meeting, and presented the succulent with a seriousness that made Serena take it with an equivalent seriousness. "It's a Haworthia," Lily said. "They're very hard to kill. I looked it up." "That's a thoughtful criterion," Serena said. "I figured you were probably busy. You need something that can handle being forgotten sometimes." Serena looked at the plant and then at the child. "You're 9 now," she said. "Your dad told me you had a birthday." "In July." Lily considered her. "You look different than November." "Better or worse?" Lily tilted her head in the assessment way. "More like yourself," she said, which was not a child's answer, and which landed on Serena in a way that she handled by looking at the succulent for a moment before looking back up. "Thank you," she said, "for this, and for the font input during construction." "The compromise was okay," Lily said. "I've seen worse." She went off to find her father, and Serena stood holding the succulent and wearing an expression that Ethan, arriving beside her a moment later, recognized as the one she wore when something had gotten past the usual defenses without asking permission. "She brought me a plant," Serena said. "I know, she deliberated about it for 2 weeks. She said I might forget it sometimes. She's planning for realistic conditions." He looked at the room, at the people, the space, the 12 engineers he could see in various corners talking to staff and patients, at Patterson near the therapy room entrance, saying something careful and specific to a young woman in a wheelchair whose hands were moving while she talked. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," she said. "Same as every important day." "That tracks?" She looked at him. In a year of looking at each other, the quality of it had changed in ways neither of them had narrated aloud, which was both of their styles and which had the natural consequence of a great deal being understood without being said. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready since 6 this morning," he said. "I walked every room." "I know," Douglas told me. "Douglas tells you everything." "Douglas tells me the things he thinks I should know, which is most things." She shifted the succulent to her other hand. "Ethan," Yeah. Whatever happens today, whatever the center becomes, however many people it reaches, however long it runs. She paused. It started with you paying attention to something everyone else walked past. I want to say that clearly, today, while there are enough witnesses that you can't deflect it. He looked at her. I was doing the thing she'd identified months ago as his specialty, checking before he confirmed. What he was checking now was whether the moment required the deflection or whether it was capable of holding the weight of the true answer. The work started with you, he said, with your body telling the truth when everyone was listening to the machine. He held her gaze. We both paid attention. That's the whole story. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, We're probably both right. Probably. The event coordinator appeared at Serena's elbow. A young woman named Jess with a tablet and the focused energy of someone who had been running on coffee and contingency planning since dawn, and said it was time for the formal remarks. And Serena nodded and handed Ethan the succulent without discussion, which he accepted without discussion, and moved toward the front of the room. The ceremony was not long. Serena had insisted on that. No speeches that ran past their time, no extended acknowledgement sections, no moment where the occasion became more about its own importance than about the people it was for. She spoke for 12 minutes. She thanked the engineering team, the clinical staff, Rosa by name, and Patterson by name, and Douglas by name. She did not make it a story about herself, which required more discipline than anyone in the room except Ethan and Douglas fully understood, because the story of how the center came to exist was a story that ran directly through her own body and her own worst year, and she was telling it without centering herself in it. Then she said, There's one more thing, and I'm going to ask the person I should be thanking to please not interrupt me because he will try to redirect the credit, and I am not going to allow it today. A small ripple of laughter through the room. Ethan, standing near the back with the succulent, did not laugh. He looked at the floor briefly, which was about as much surrender as he was capable of. She told it cleanly. Not all of it. Not the NDA and the licensing firm and the price that had been 4% of fair market value, because that wasn't the room for that. And some things were between the people they were between. But she told the part about a man with a dented toolbox who had asked different questions than everyone else. She told the part about the hip angle and the nerve pathway, and the signal finally landing where it was supposed to land. She told the part about a garage in Millbrook, where veterans and accident survivors and families who couldn't afford what they needed had been bringing equipment for 8 years to a mechanic who was more than he appeared. What I learned this year, she said, is that expertise and attention are not the same thing. I had access to a great deal of expertise. What I needed was someone willing to look. She paused. The Pathway Center exists because one person looked. Everything else followed from that. The room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet when something true has been said without decoration. Then the applause came, and it was the kind that starts before anyone decides to start it. The first patients were already in the therapy rooms by noon. Ethan had wanted it that way. No long gap between ceremony and function, no day that was only about the idea of the thing rather than the thing itself. The first cohort was 12 patients, selected from the wait list according to the intake criteria his team had developed. Cases where standard rehabilitation protocols had reached a ceiling, where the existing system had measured the patient against a profile they didn't fit and called the gap a limitation rather than a design flaw. He moved through the rooms during those first sessions, not supervising. His engineers knew what they were doing, but present, the way he'd learned from watching Rosa that presence was its own kind of resource. He stopped when he was useful and kept moving when he wasn't. He answered questions. He looked at what was being looked at and asked whether anyone had considered the adjacent thing that no one was looking at yet. In room 4, an 11-year-old girl named Daria was in her second session with one of the younger engineers, a 25-year-old named Marcus, no relation to the board. Marcus, who had an ability to communicate with children about their own bodies that Ethan had spotted in the interview and hired him for immediately. Daria had a spinal condition that had progressed differently than her case profile predicted, which meant the standard equipment had been built for a version of her that no longer existed. She'd been in and out of rehabilitation programs for 3 years. She was 11 and already expert at the specific exhaustion of being told the system was correct and her body was the anomaly. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched Marcus talk her through the positioning assessment, asking her to describe what she felt in her own words, writing down the words she used rather than translating them immediately into clinical language. She was cautious at first, the caution of a kid who had learned not to get interested in things that might not work. Then Marcus said something that made her laugh, a short surprise laugh, and the caution loosened slightly, and she started talking more freely, and Ethan watched the loosening with the feeling he'd been carrying all day, and finally understood was not pride exactly, but something older than pride. It was the feeling of work finding its purpose, of a loop closing that had been open for a very long time. He left the doorway and kept moving. At 4 in the afternoon, when the first sessions had wrapped and the staff was debriefing and the patients and families were being walked through the follow-up protocols, Serena found him in his lab in the East Wing. He was at the workbench. Of course he was at the workbench. She'd stopped being surprised by this months ago. Going through a set of components for a custom assessment tool he'd been designing for a case in the second cohort. The old toolbox was on the shelf above the bench. She'd asked him once why he kept it rather than using the new equipment cases the center had procured, and he'd said it worked fine, and she'd understood that the answer was not about the toolbox. She came and stood beside him. He moved the components slightly to make room, which was as formal as the welcome got between them by this point. "Good day?" she said. "Yeah." Daria's session went well. Marcus filed a preliminary assessment. "It's thorough." "He's thorough," Ethan said. "He'll be good." "Patterson cried," she said. Ethan looked up. "Patterson." "Just briefly, in the hallway after room 6. He didn't think anyone saw." A pause. "I saw." Ethan looked back at the components. He thought about Patterson on the stool 8 months ago, updating his model, not knowing yet how far the update would go. "Good for him," he said quietly. "Room 6 was... that was a hard case. 63-year-old veteran. 12 years of wrong protocols. The engineer told me there was sensation in his left foot by the end of the second sequence." Ethan set down the tool. 12 years. He let that sit for a moment without rushing past it, because some facts deserved the weight of being held. Serena was watching him. In the low light of the lab, the shadows were longer, the city visible through the east windows already shifting toward evening, and she was leaning against the workbench beside him with the support frame exactly as it needed to be, and her posture easy in the way it had become over months of work. Not the ease of someone who had stopped fighting, but the ease of someone who had learned that fighting didn't have to look like bracing. "I want to show you something," she said. "Outside." He looked at her. "Now?" "The day's not over yet," she said. They went through the east exit to the small courtyard behind the building, a paved space that Ethan had insisted on during construction, arguing that patients needed somewhere to be outside during long therapy days, somewhere that wasn't a waiting room or a medical space. It had 3 wooden benches and 2 planters and a view of the street that was not beautiful, but was real, which he decided was better. The evening air was cool in the October way. Not cold, just specific, the kind of temperature that made you aware of the season without announcing it. Serena stopped at the center of the courtyard. She handed him the support frame handle, not releasing it to him, just sharing the contact point so that his hand was on the frame and hers was not. He understood what she was about to do. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. "That's the point." She let go. She had been working toward this for weeks. Rosa knew, Ethan knew, the measurements had all been tracking toward this for the past 3 sessions. The nerve pathway response was strong and consistent. The muscle engagement in both legs had reached the threshold Rosa had identified as the prerequisite. Serena's own assessment of her readiness had been cautious and accurate, both of which were characteristic. What was not in the measurements was this: the specific quality of her face when she took the first step without the frame. It was slow. It was effortful in a way that was completely visible, her jaw set, her breathing deliberate, her body having a conversation with itself in real time about weight and balance and the very old biological business of putting one foot in front of the other. The step was small. The second one was smaller. The third one covered maybe 18 inches of courtyard paving and took more out of her than most people expend on a flight of stairs. She stopped. She was breathing hard. She was standing in the middle of the courtyard without the frame, and her eyes were wet, and she was looking at him with an expression he had no useful way to describe and wasn't sure he needed to.
3, she said. 3, he confirmed. Rosa said to start with 3. Rosa's usually right about thresholds. A sound escaped her, something between a laugh and the exhale of someone who has been holding something in their chest for so long they'd forgotten it was weight. She stood there in the October evening and let it happen, and Ethan stood 4 feet away and watched her without moving, because some things needed to be witnessed rather than managed. After a moment, she said, "Come here." He went to her. She put her hand on his arm, so, not for balance, he knew the difference now, just contact. And they stood in the courtyard while the evening settled and the city did its unremarkable ongoing thing around them. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "Okay. And you're not going to redirect it." "I'll try." "Don't try, just don't." She looked at him directly. "I spent a year watching you give everything you had to something and take almost none of it back. You fixed my body. You built that." She gestured at the building. "Out of a theory you described in my study in November while I was trying to figure out what you actually were. You showed my daughter that the work matters more than the credit, which is a thing I was still learning myself." She paused. "You did all of that, and you are still the most difficult person to thank that I have ever encountered in my professional life, which is saying something because I've encountered Marcus." He looked at her. He let the words sit rather than moving to manage them. "I hear you," he said. "Good. For what it's worth," he said, "watching you take those steps." He stopped. Started again. "There's a word for what that is. I don't have it right now." "That's all right," she said. "You don't always need the word." He was quiet for a moment. They were standing close in the way you stand when something has been circling for long enough that the distance finally just closes. He was aware of her hand on his arm and of the October air and of the specific weight of a year that had contained more than most years managed. "Lily thinks you should get the cat," he said. "Lily has a very consistent position on the cat. She's been consistent about marine biology for 3 years. She commits." Serena made the real laugh, the warm, unguarded one. "Tell her I'm considering it. She'll take that as a yes." "It's meant as a yes." She looked at him. "She's going to want to name it." "She already has names," he said. "She has a list. It's alphabetized." Serena shook her head in a way that was not disbelief but something much fonder than that. "Of course she does." They stood in the courtyard a little longer. Not because there was more to say. Most of what needed saying had been said over the course of a year in labs and therapy rooms and studies, and a kitchen in Millbrook where the bills sat on the counter and the math was always harder than it should have been. They stood there because the day had been long and consequential, and sometimes the right response to a long consequential day is to let it finish at its own pace rather than moving straight to whatever comes next. What came next would be real and imperfect and full of the friction that attends anything worth doing. There were patients with cases that would resist every approach the center tried. There were board dynamics that would never be entirely clean. There were engineering problems that would refuse to be solved by any available configuration of insight and patience, because some problems were genuinely hard, and the world didn't owe you a solution just because you looked carefully enough. There was the ongoing work of raising Lily, which Ethan did well and imperfectly in equal measure, and had stopped expecting to do otherwise. There was the ongoing work of learning how to be two people who had started as strangers and become. Through the specific alchemy of shared work and mutual honesty, and enough time in rooms together that the pretense of distance stopped being worth maintaining, something neither of them had quite had a name for yet, and both of them were in no particular hurry to name. The naming could wait. The work was real, the center was open, the signal was getting through, and in room 4, Daria had laughed. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, exactly the size of thing the center had been built to produce. Not the grand resolution, not the miracle announced from a podium, but the specific, ordinary, extraordinary moment when someone who had learned to stop expecting anything unexpected found themselves surprised. When the body said, "I'm still here," in a language someone had finally taken the trouble to learn. Ethan had believed for most of his adult life that the work mattered more than anything else. More than recognition, more than circumstance, more than the specific shape of the life surrounding it. He still believed that. But he'd learned this year, slowly and against his own habits,
That the work was not diminished by being surrounded by people who saw it. That letting someone witness what you were doing did not make you less the person doing it. He'd learned it from a woman who took 3 steps across a courtyard and stood in the evening air and called it what it was. He'd been learning it from his daughter for 8 years and not quite hearing it until now. Some lessons needed the right conditions to land. The courtyard light had gone amber, then gray, the city's own illumination starting to assert itself against the darkening sky. Inside the building, Ethan could hear voices, staff wrapping up, someone's laugh in the east hallway, the soft mechanical sounds of equipment being set to rest for the night. "We should go back in," Serena said. "Probably." Neither of them moved immediately. That was all right. The building would still be there. The work would still be there. It always was.